Welcome to the Fix Your Gut podcast. My name is Jason Hooper, and I'm here with John Brissom.
How you doing, everybody?
We're here today to talk about flu shots. So I guess first we should start just talking about influenza and what the flu virus is and what it does. Most of the time we talk about influenza A and influenza B, but there's actually 4 different subtypes of influenza, and it's one of the diseases that is cross-species. So influenza A, for instance, can go back and forth between birds and humans, and I think even certain strains can cross between pigs. The H3N2 variant has been known to infect dogs, and so that's primarily what we focus on is influenza A, is just because it spreads a lot more. Influenza B isn't that way, so it's that particular variant. It seems to only infect people. So,
and it spreads very slowly.
Yeah.
Compared to influenza A, which is very rapidly spread.
And then influenza C is really hard for people to get unless you're immunocompromised, but it's possible to contract, through PCR testing, polymerase chain reaction. They've been able to detect influenza C in people, but it's usually just like pigs, sometimes dogs. Influenza D only seems to infect pigs and cattle, and there's never been a case of it reported in humans.
Yeah. Usually when you think of influenza A, you think of H1N1, which is, it's very easily spread, and influenza A can be rarely fatal. And, most people actually, the virus themselves, it doesn't trigger the actual, well, it triggers a cytokine response or a cytokine storm, which actually is the body's immune system, what actually causes the most problems with most strains of influenza A compared to the virus itself. So, yeah.
So when John talks about like H1N1, we talk about the H and the N are important because they're proteins on the outside of the viron. We put these viruses into subtypes based on the types of proteins, which are different in each of these, like H1N1, H2N2, so on and so forth. There's, I believe, we know about 16 different types of hemagglutinin, which is what H stands for, that's on the outside of the viron, and the N stands for neuraminidase. The H, or the hemagglutinin, is how the virus gets into our cells, and the N, or the neuraminidase, is how they escape once they replicate. So both of those are important, and they're going to be important to talk about when we start to talk about how to develop a vaccination for the flu. Now, H1N1 has a specific type of hemagglutinin that can replicate in the nasal tissues and the lung tissues. Some of the other ones can enter the cells through other places because there has to be some sort of peptidase that's expressed in that area that will cleave off that protein for it to be able to enter the cell. It's kind of unfortunate that our body's own reaction to the virus is how it spreads. When we try to cleave off, it tries to cleave off some of its proteins to kill it, and it just lets it enter the cell. And then once it gets into the cell, the body's defense is to start lowering the pH of the cell, making it more acidic to kill the virus. And that causes the proteins to unfold so that they can latch on to the external part of the cell and actually end up destroying the cell, which is why, since the flu virus, unlike the rhinovirus or the cold virus, the flu virus actually destroys and damages tissues. Once it escapes the cell, it pretty much destroys the cell. So that's one of the reasons why the body responds to it so severely with cytokines, and can even create cytokine storm, which is basically like when the white blood cells start expressing cytokines, and then as a result, the cytokines lead to the expression of more white blood cells, and then so on and so forth until you end up with a lot of cytokines.
Yeah, there's different strains, that could trigger, H1N1, for example, it can trigger a very strong cytokine response, but it really doesn't cause too much cellular damage. Or H5N1, it can cause tremendous cellular damage and can even trigger cytokine storms. But the good news about H5N1 or bird flu is that it spreads very slowly, but it can definitely cause, very strong destruction. But usually with H1N1, when they had, we'll talk about the Spanish flu later, and we'll talk about the recent swine flu epidemic in the late 2000s, is that it was causing more issues for people with robust immune systems, like teenagers and young adults, than it was actually the elderly. The elderly were dying less because there was less chance for cytokine storms.
Right. Yeah. Bird flu, the H5N1 subtype that caused so many deaths in 2004, that particular strain replicated more slowly, which is why it did so much damage to the lungs. It was that particular hemagglutinin variant was pretty nasty. It was probably, in my opinion, the most dangerous of all the subtypes.
Yes.
The H1N1 has killed the most people. The Spanish flu in 1918, I've seen different reports on the number of deaths. I've seen it be as low as 2 million and as high as 100 million.
Yeah, and I would say that is a possibility that it may not even been, and we'll talk about it. I guess we could go and talk about the Spanish flu now, but it may have been because doctors at that time were prescribing 2 to 15 grams of aspirin a day. Which would have caused them major problems.
In 2009, the H1N1 variant also was known as the swine flu.
Yes.
So it's the same. It was probably the same variant as the 1918 flu. I think before we go and talk about some of the details of some of these viral subtypes and talk about the Spanish flu, I think it's very important to just get our vocabulary straight when it comes to subtype and strain. Okay, the subtype is got the H in the ends with a number following each of them. And that's what's important for inoculation. The strain, it has to do with the nuclear material that's in the center of the viron. And it's not as important as we're developing a vaccine, because when you're talking about the immune system and, antigens and antibodies, IgG and all that kind of stuff, the surface proteins are how the body is able to recognize whether it's something that should be here or should not be here, and what to do about it. So that sort of classification, the H's and the N's, those are the viral subtypes. It kind of has to do with how the virus enters in the body, how it infects us, and how we can try to develop a vaccine for it.
So I guess when we talk about, the H1N1 subtype, which caused both the Spanish flu in 1918 and the swine flu in 2009, like we mentioned earlier, the Spanish flu also, they call it the 1918 influenza pandemic around that time. Like you said, there's different amounts of how many people it supposedly killed. They talk about how it possibly even infected about 500 million people around the world. But as we had mentioned beforehand of why it was so strong, as far as the increase of mortality rate, because, as we will talk about later, the flu, it doesn't really have very strong, a huge swing of a mortality rate like that generally. And this one may have been because, like I mentioned earlier, doctors at that time were prescribing, I've seen anywhere between 5 to 25, even 31 grams of aspirin per day. So people actually were probably dying from aspirin poisoning more than they actually were dying from, the pandemic itself.
How many grams at the highest range did you say?
31 grams of aspirin 31? Per day. Yes.
It's like a third of a bottle of bear, right?
Yeah, and Karen Starko was she wrote the 2009 paper in the Clinical Infectious Diseases. She talks about at that levels, it would at least produce hyperventilation in 33% of people and lung edema, at least at between 3 to 5. So, a lot of deaths that were reported from the Spanish flu at that time, they showed signs of like wet lungs, like hemorrhagic lungs, not necessarily bacterial pneumonia full of biofilm and everything that you would normally see in someone that has with bacterial forma. So it is a possibility that that the subtype during that time, the H1N1 that caused the Spanish flu, may have been more virulent, possibly, but definitely the aspirin poisonings contribute to a perfect storm that sadly led to a lot of deaths.
Yeah, it didn't seem like they were using that treatment before or after
No.
the Spanish flu. It was not as prevalent. So I mean, for them to even go in that direction, I would think that it had to be pretty virulent anyway. It had to be showing that it was lethal for a lot of people already before they would go to such extreme measures. But yeah, I mean, it was the number one killer in 1918, more than anything else around. It was killing more people. That's crazy to me that the flu was killing more people than heart attack.
Supposedly started, at least within the United States, the first wave of the epidemic started in U.S. military camps. And some people have reported as a possibility that a lot of people were getting vaccinations at that time. Now, you can argue whether or not that could have, weakened their immune system or lowered it to the flu. And there's some debate about that. Anti-vaxxers will say that's definitely the cause, and vaccinations will say, well, that could not be the cause at all. But yeah, it is interesting of, its point of origin were, reported, in military camps.
Yeah, doing this podcast, doing any kind of a podcast or putting out any information about vaccines is definitely going to irritate some people on either side of the argument, because you want to hurt your viewership or your listenership. You just start talking about vaccines, and
which we're doing today. So
yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting topic, and I think it's not only an interesting topic because we can start to judge the efficacy of a flu vaccine, but we can also kind of understand how the immune system works, and the mechanics of how the body discovers viruses, bacteria, that kind of stuff, and how vaccines work. And so for people that don't believe that anybody should be vaccinated, they have an open mind to this, they might learn something about how certain vaccines could be helpful based on how they work. And for people who think that everybody should be vaccinated for every single thing all the time, they might learn that there are some vaccines out there that have higher risks than rewards.
Yes.
So that's my goal anyway. Again, requiring people to have an open mind and not get so tribal about things as simple as vaccines. But anyway, so Spanish flu, definitely not something you want to get back in 1918.
No, and you definitely did not want to take half a bottle of aspirin.
No, for sure. But yeah, there have been other strains that have killed a lot of people too. Like the bird flu, I think, killed around 1.5 million. The Hong Kong flu probably killed a couple million. So, the flu is no joke. I've had the flu probably, I don't know, a handful of times. And for me, it wasn't fun, but it wasn't something that I felt like I was going to die from. I don't know. Have you had the flu, John?
It's been years. It's been a long time since I have gotten the flu. I can't even remember. I don't even actually remember having the flu at all. Yeah, I think I had the stomach flu, but that's different. I mean, it's not the same.
It's not really influenza.
No, it's not. Gastrointestinal virus. But other than as a child, I actually never remember getting the flu. I might have gotten it when I had asthma really bad as a child. But since then, at least in my young adulthood, I've gotten a cold for a few days, but not the flu.
Most of the flu strains in humans only attack the lungs, okay? And usually like vomiting and diarrhea are not side effects of the flu. So that's kind of
Well, it can be in children for some reason.
Children, yeah.
Especially influenza B can definitely cause gastrointestinal issues. But generally,
Yeah.
you're right. In adults, that's. I mean, I've seen. Right. I mean, we got to realize too. There's at least 35 to at least 33 to 35% of people who come in contact with the influenza virus that they're asymptomatic. They don't even show signs of an infection to it.
Mhm.
So and then even there, I think the symptoms of like most viral infections usually start 1 or 2 days afterwards. And you, like you said, you usually get a fever, muscle aches and body chills, which are generally, reactions to cytokines, and nose issues and throat issues and lung issues.
Yeah, that's, I mean, it's called influenza for a reason. So that's what it tends to affect. In any case, yeah, so let's get into, I guess, the idea behind creating vaccine. So, what is a vaccine and how does it work? So, there are different types of vaccines and there are different methods for inoculating people against diseases. And the goal of the vaccine is to basically teach their immune system to look out for certain diseases. And so trying to get their immune system to start preemptively producing antibodies and antigens, like IG or antibodies like IgG, so that when they come into contact with it, the body recognizes it immediately and starts to fight it rather than becoming infected.
And also
And
increase the helper cell production of helper cells too, as well, whether it's Th1 or Th2, depending on the purpose of the vaccination and the adjuncts that are added to it as well.
right. And so when we talk about the influenza antigenic types like influenza virus A, B, C, and D, those are the types of antigens that we see in response to that particular virus. So if we have them already, the idea is that we won't get sick when we come into contact with it because the body already knows it's there and will start attacking it before it starts attacking our cells and replicating so quickly. Now, with a lot of viruses, there's not a lot of mutation or genetic drift that's involved. And so it's really easy to, the surface proteins are where they are, and it's easy to kind of teach the body to identify those proteins and be able to attack it. However, with the flu, there are so many different types of surface proteins. If you just look at influenza virus A, there's 16 variants of H, and there's, 8 variants of N. So that's like 144 variants or 144 different combinations that you can look out for just with influenza A. Our vaccination process, how we're making vaccines is not really changed too much in the last 50 years. And it takes a long time to make these vaccines. It takes about a year. So one of the challenges is that they have to be able to predict which surface proteins are going to be likely to occur within the given population a year in advance. And that's very difficult to do. And I can't ever remember a time where they've come out saying, "Yep, we hit the nail on the head. We got it completely down this year." They're usually like, "Yep, we were close," or something, and they still try to say like, "Well, we missed it again this year, guys. Sorry, but hey, go ahead and get your flu shots anyway, because if you do get the flu, it might still protect you from the flu somehow anyway. And if you do get the flu, well, you might get like an abbreviated, less virulent version of
So
it." And I
on
don't,
that topic, Jason,
yeah,
if you see a medical expert or someone from the CDC on television, they'll say exactly what you just said, and
right,
and if you ask your doctor or ask your pharmacist, but let's say that you happen to just ask for a package insert on the
mhm,
flu vaccine, and so what do most of the package inserts say? Well, I'm going to read this one. This one is from Seqirus's trivalent vaccine. Antibody against one influenza virus type or subtype confers limited or no protection against another. Furthermore, antibody to one antigen variant of influenza virus may not protect against a new antigenic variant of the same type or subtype. And if you actually go through each package insert for each vaccination, they all say similar wording to that. So if the package insert for the flu vaccine from the pharmaceutical companies state that that's impossible, then why do doctors and healthcare professionals and even people from the CDC walk around and talk like that's gospel?
I don't know.
I don't know either. I mean, it's in the package inserts. I mean, how could, if they guessed a strain wrong, how could it? I mean, maybe I guess for a short period of time, if you get an increase of a Th1 response, maybe. But I mean, especially later when we actually talk about the FluMist, the live attenuated vaccination that you get up your nasal passages, that's even sillier. So it just if you go to your Walgreens and you see the signs talk about get your flu shot, or even give you a gift card or whatever, if you see any literature that says that if you get this flu vaccine, it's going to protect you from other variants that were not inside the used inside the vaccination, that's complete BS.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to play devil's advocate here and trying to form a counter argument to that, but I think I can't even come up with anything. So why do you think that there's that misinformation that's out there?
And I mean, do you want me to put my tinfoil hat on and just say it's to sell more? It's this part of the vernacular that everybody repeats, and it's really just to sell more flu vaccinations. And doctors don't read. If you next time you go to your doctor and they ask if you want to get a flu shot, ask them if they've ever read the package insert for the flu vaccination. I seriously doubt they have.
Do you did you get these online, or do you have the actual packets?
I got them online through the CDC website.
Okay.
And each individual pharmaceutical company that produced the package inserts. I did happen to get one physical copy. I walked into Walgreens for the Sequarius trivalent one, and I do have it on hand, and it does match what was published. So
that's cool. Yeah, that's interesting. So and like basically you open up the package for the flu shot or whatever, and it's there. It's what's in there.
Well, they do that with every medication. I mean, there's always a package insert.
Yeah, I mean, and not just with medications, but other stuff too. I mean, you go and buy something, and there's that package insert or whatever, and you just throw it away. It's like that Tim Allen joke from Home Improvement. Just throw away the instructions, and you just start using it.
Right? Yeah, I mean, you can Google. It's all on the FDA and CDC websites and the pharmaceutical. You can find all these package inserts. It takes like 2 seconds to find it. It's all there. I mean, the FDA has it for every medication, including the vaccinations too. So, I mean, it's not like it's hard to track down. It's all there,
So let's picture a world where that information would be accurate, or you could get close in your development of a vaccine. You could get close to the correct external proteins on the outside of the viron, and have it still be effective. What would that imply for other things? Like if you didn't have to have it down to an exact science with vaccines, what would that imply for the rest of the immune system? And how many other compounds are close enough to one another to whether it would trigger immune reactions? We would basically all have autoimmune conditions that were pretty much untreatable. Like we would all be on immunosuppressants if that were the case, right? Because
our immune system couldn't differentiate.
Yeah, I mean, it would just start attacking. It's like, well, what's that? I don't know. That's pretty close to something that we know is bad. Well, let's kill it. Okay, well then now we're dead. So, or even with like our own blood type, we've got our blood type values our red blood cells have external proteins, and that's kind of how we differentiate blood type. And if you get the wrong blood, like if you have a blood infusion, if you have to get a transfusion, couldn't remember the word. If you get a transfusion and you get the wrong blood type, well, that causes kind of a cytokine storm also, or, same thing with graft versus host disease. If you get bone marrow transplants, the wrong type, or an organ transplants, wrong type, it makes you really sick. There's just not a world where that exists, where the immune system just doesn't work that way. And if it did work that way, we'd be in a lot of trouble.
They swear it does, Jason. It helps. They have data that is not reference of these vaccine inserts or any. If you really look in the studies, any true studies that I've seen.
I did. I looked at some of the studies that you sent me that were published by the CDC. The ones that are claiming that the flu shot last year was 48% effective, and still, even looking at their data, like I tried to push the numbers around any way that I could to figure out where they came up with that number 48, and I couldn't. But basically, what their survey did, it was a good sample. They sampled 5 different populations, and they just did a basic survey. And they said, "Hey, have you gotten the flu this year? Yes or no? Hey, did you get the flu shot this year? Yes or no?"
And it was people that came into those 5 locations with upper respiratory infections.
Right. And so when they had the upper respiratory infection, did it end up being the flu or was it something else? And how many of those people had the flu shot? So the interesting thing is that when they reported the information back, they didn't quite report it in the way that they collected it, meaning that they didn't show how many people who had gotten the flu vaccine still got the flu virus versus how many didn't. They just said, this was the total number that got the vaccination. This was the total number that got the flu virus. And this is the total number that didn't. So we only had 3 variables instead of the 4th that could have been produced with that questionnaire, because it's like, okay, well, how many people that got the flu virus still got infected? That would have been interesting to me, but for some reason they didn't present the data that way. So what I did was I took the data and I figured out the difference in the people that were infected that weren't, and the ratio of people that got the flu vaccines and didn't. And I did a statistical comparison between the 5 different sample sites that they chose. And I had a pretty conservative alpha level set. My confidence interval was pretty conservative. And I found that there was absolutely no correlation between the people who got the flu shot, or the number of instances of flu shots, and the total outcome of people getting the flu. So
yeah, and that was one of the first years of actually reported the unvaccinated and that being virus negative. And if you do the math, like you said, there's not really any statistical difference between the two. Now, there was a difference. Actually, you might find this interesting. There was a difference where, so most of the sites are up in states that are northern in the United States, like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Washington, and Wisconsin. Texas was the only one that was a southern state, and it actually had less across the board positive influenza virus positive cases, both in the unvaccinated and the vaccinated. So that would assume, I don't know, maybe there's a vitamin D component to that in the Texas population compared to the other northern populations, but we'll talk about that later.
Maybe so. I mean, I live in Texas, and it seems like I remember when the swine flu came in, they alleged that case 0 was in Mexico, and then it came in through Texas. So it's interesting kind of how viruses spread. I watched a YouTube video once, and maybe we can post it in the show notes if I can find it again, on kind of like how these subtypes spread around the globe, and starts to show where they mutate, and it starts to show like where there's gene reassortment and all this stuff. And I found it interesting. They used a lot of cool color coding to kind of show you what was going on and essentially show why it's so hard to predict for the flu subtypes when developing vaccines.
But with it starting, the swine flu starting in Mexico, could that have been because Mexico dealing with a little bit more, malnourishment than the United States in combination with close proximity of farmers to farm animals?
I couldn't even tell you.
I mean, you'd have more exposure to the sun, being closer to the equator, so vitamin D levels should be normal, but there has to be other factors of reason why it would start there. For example, the reason why they say the avian flu a lot of times occurs in Asian countries is because the close proximity of people who sell chickens, living with the poultry themselves, makes you more prone to be around the virus. So that's usually how they correlate those together.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I know that in Texas we have a lot of wild hogs, and it's a huge problem. Farmers will hire people to go out on helicopters and just shoot as many wild hogs as they can with machine guns and stuff, just to try to take them down, because they can do millions of dollars worth of damage in a night just going through somebody's field and just destroying it. So that might have something to do with it. I really don't know. I know that temperature has a factor in how long that the cold virus can stay outside of a host on contaminated surfaces and whatever, and even in the air. Lower temperatures seem to be able to protect the virus, but I I really don't. As far as causation here, like I have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, we can speculate all day. For example, Washington State being very cloudy and sunlight exposure itself does have a disinfectant property.
Yeah, the UV light will kill the virus for sure. Yeah.
So, we could speculate, but that is very interesting, though. We're talking about that when we talk about that study of Texas did have less cases of reported influenza, as well as, like we mentioned, if you actually run the data on the flu vaccine, there's not really much difference in whether you got it or not, you contracted influenza. And if you look at the data for the nasal flu vaccine through even the most recent studies in the past, 5 years or so, it doesn't offer any protection, and it possibly may even spread the virus. And I will. I guess we might as well go ahead and talk about that real quick. So we talk about the FluMist quadrivalent, which means it's just four subtypes within the FluMist vaccination itself. It is known to. It is live, though attenuated, so you do shed it. So the studies that we have is that the younger the person who's exposed, and they don't recommend children get the FluMist. Well, they hadn't until recently. Actually, the CDC is actually starting to say that it's okay. They did this year, which is ludicrous because it hasn't really been shown to be used in children, but whatever. But so they did a study of about 600 subjects of whether or not they shedded the flu viruses after getting the FluMist. And the younger the person was who got the FluMist vaccination, the more shedding occurred and the longer it occurred. So, for example, out of the 100 subjects that were 2 years, 90% of them shed. And 7% of them were still shedding after the 11th day. Where adults that they studied was about 20% were shedded and still shedding, and 1% were shedding still after day 11. So you can spread the flu, those specific strains, by getting a nasal FluMist, because you will shed the flu, especially if you got a runny nose previously beforehand, or allergies or whatever, and you're touching it, and you're getting it everywhere, you will spread it. So they did do one randomized crossover double-blind study in children that were at a daycare, and only one kid they determined was able to get the actual flu from the FluMist vaccination that was not vaccinated. But nonetheless, it was such a small population of only about 100 something children that you'd have to replicate that more. So especially if you're working at a hospital full of immune compromised patients, you probably don't want to get the FluMist vaccination because you'll shed those viruses a known amount of time that you would shed them, and who you may give them to.
That's sort of a way that with the live virus, you wouldn't have to have any kind of prediction, right? Because you could just collect a sample that's in that area and say, okay, well, this is the viral subtype that's being spread around this area, and then just make the mist out of that. Unfortunately, well, what's the difference between getting the mist and then coming into contact with an infected person, having them sneeze on you? Right?
There's not really much differences. I mean, it is weekend.
I guess
it is weekend.
Yeah, and it's not the constant, because somebody's like sneezes on you, you probably have more than 1 million viral particles coming at you, whereas this is significantly less. So I guess that's kind of not.
But you are getting some good old monosodium glutamate up your nose. And a little.
That's probably not good for you.
Yeah, I mean,
intranasal MSG. I don't think I can recommend that, actually, because
it is an additive ingredient of FluMist.
Yeah, it's a preservative, just like it's
and there is a little bit of sucrose, which would change the nasal microbiome, as well as a very, very small amount. One of the mycin antibiotics. I don't remember exactly which one, but it's a very
I can't remember which one it is.
It's not neomycin; it's another one. But so that tobamycin. So that would change a little bit of the nasal microbiome to some degree.
Yeah, it would a little bit. It's I don't know. It's just like a preservative. They just don't want bacteria growing in their nasal mist while they're trying to keep the virus alive in there. But yeah, it's an interesting idea, but the studies have pretty much come out and said that it's not effective.
And it could spread the flu too as well, possibly.
It's possible. It's possible. Yeah. I mean, it's not outside of the realm of possibility. I don't think it will to a significant degree because of the quantity of.
I mean, they even recommend kids that are on salicylic therapy, which most kids should not be because of can cause Reye's syndrome. But if you were taking, if your child, under the age of 17 was taking aspirin or ibuprofen, that they should not get the FluMist because it could trigger Reye's syndrome.
Yeah, that particular compound in general interacts with the flu virus, so you shouldn't mix those together.
And also, there have been an increased risk of wheezing and asthmatic symptoms, at least in kids that are younger than 5, with the administration of the FluMist. That was talked about in the studies and talked about in the vaccine insert package.
Mm.
Now, one thing I want to discuss with you real quick, Jason, is one common thing that I see in all of these vaccine inserts, and I'll read from both the quadrivalent shot and the FluMist, is they actually mention in these inserts, and I wanted to get your opinion on that. It says for the FluMist quadrivalent has not been evaluated for its carcinogenic, mutagenic potential or its potential to impair fertility. Isn't that kind of important before you give? I mean, don't medications, I know vaccines are quote unquote exempt, but isn't that important?
Well,
especially if you're giving it to pregnant women?
Well, I mean, it's just the scrutiny of the FDA. They just have a hierarchy of compounds that they tend to scrutinize more, like medications. Prescription medications are scrutinized beyond belief. Supplements are generally unregulated, except in the case of creatine. For some reason, they're starting to crack down on it. I don't know why, but there's just a range of different classifications. And so with vaccines, they are not required to do that. But if it would be an analgesic medication or something like that, then they would.
Well, they do it. They claim it's for the public good.
Okay.
I mean, for like a fluoroquadrivalent, the shot has not been evaluated for carcinogenic or mutagenic potential or male infertility. But it has been studied in rats, though not humans, for no impact on female fertility. So, I mean, shouldn't there be studies, like even after these shots have been out for so long, shouldn't they eventually do those studies just to...
I don't know. I mean, have they done a study on caphrasterol? I mean, have they done a study on...
They do carcinogenic and mutagenic potential studies on medications.
They do, but what about supplements? I mean, that we recommend on the site, like, have they tested D-limonene and infertility?
Yeah, D-limonene is generally recognized as safe as a food additive, so yes, they have done that.
Okay, but they've had a specific study.
They've studied the carcinogenic, the toxigenic, and the mutagenic potential of D-limonene, yes.
Okay.
Because it's used as a cleaner and as a solvent and as a food additive, so it would have to be.
Yeah. I don't know. I just can't remember reading a study that said, like, all right, we tested the sperm counts of men and whatever before and after taking high doses of D-limonene, or
they've done it the base, not in humans, but they've done it in rats. They've done at least the base studies. And they haven't even done the base studies in the majority of these vaccinations. So at least flu vaccinations.
Yeah. And the flu vaccine, though, they still use Thermosol. And
they do.
So
you can request it to be Thermosol free, but...
Yeah, so we do know that there are certain additives in there that are toxic, and there are some medications that are toxic too, that have toxicity,
Well, the problem with Thermosol is that it's not necessarily maybe getting that low dose in the flu vaccination itself one time. It's a compound dosage. For example, if you're getting the flu vaccine for a pregnant woman and, they have like 5 or 6 mercury amalgams in, and, they used to eat a lot of tuna, you don't know what their mercury burden is. And there have been studies that talked about Thermosol, and being that reaction is since you don't know a person's mercury burden and you're adding more mercury to that, it could affect a fetus or a developing infant. That's the problem is we don't know a person's average mercury. Dr. Andrew Cutler would talk a lot about that, their mercury burden. And there is a very well put study in the toxicity of methylmercury and thimerosal and its comparison to methylmercury in the Journal of Applied Toxicology in August 2013 that raises those exact same points. And that is we really, the CDC will claim, well, thimerosal is very easily broken down and eliminated from the body. And that is true compared to methylmercury. But that being said, if a person has a very high mercury burden to begin with, that may not necessarily be the case. And this study talks directly about that.
Well, the other thing is that it's an intramuscular injection, so it doesn't go through the gut. And so like if you eat something that has ethyl mercury in it, there are microbes that can convert that to methyl mercury in the gut, and they do. So when you're consuming something with mercury, it's more dangerous than, in my opinion, more dangerous than intramuscular injection.
But it's still a problem, though, a compounded problem. It's not.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's a heavy metal, and it has to be bound and excreted, and it takes, it comes at a biological cost. You have to have glutathione, you have to have transport proteins, you have to have a lot of stuff going on. So,
the CDC just looks at it as a snapshot and pretty much states it's safe, but not looking at a person's mercury burden and how much an individual person is dealing with mercury. It's ludicrous to look at it that way.
Okay. So it's like, okay, well, we should evaluate how much mercury people are getting, and maybe that 50 micrograms or whatever that is in their flu shot is going to push them over into some more severe health issues.
Yeah, and there's no look at that, and that's my problem. I mean, and they do offer vaccinations without flu vaccinations without thimerosal. You can ask them. Now, what's hilarious about that is I saw Walgreens was running an ad that said preservative-free flu vaccinations, and I was like, wow! So they took out like neomycin and and everything like that. No, they just meant thimerosal. So it's just, if you're going to advertise preservative-free, it better be preservative-free, because someone could probably sue Walgreens for false advertising in the heavy tort country that we live in. But yeah, it's just, thimerosal is probably something that you would not want to be exposed to, even though the CDC, and that's the whole thing about flu vaccines. The biggest giveaway I want to give at least I want to give away on this podcast, is flu vaccines are ineffective at best and harmful at worst.
Yeah, there's some risks for sure with any vaccine that you could get complications. The risks are pretty low, in my opinion.
I disagree. I think they're underreported because most doctors don't think vaccines can cause problems, sadly. So I think they're actually probably underreported. Now, I think it's not as high as a lot of people who are cautious about vaccinations think that they are, but I don't think it's as low as pro-vaxxers say they are either. I think it's probably it's probably higher than that. So, I mean, what about GBS and it's associated with, flu vaccines and everything? The risk of it, at least reported, seems to be quite low. I think it's a little bit possibly higher than what the CDC is reporting. But nonetheless, especially as a cause of GBS might be a Campylobacter jejuni dysbiosis. If you ever tested positive for having a good amount of Campylobacter jejuni in your digestive tract, or recently got over food poisoning, you probably don't want to get a flu vaccination because it could trigger.
Or any other vaccination.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, well, if you look at something like hepatitis vaccination or something, it's a one-shot deal. I mean,
but why give it an infant though?
Literally.
But why give it?
Well, I don't know.
That's my problem.
I mean, in case they're exposed, but like, let's say you're working in the food industry, or let's say you're working around a lot of, I don't know. Let's say that you like to compete in mixed martial arts on Thursdays, and you're around people with blood.
But why give it to infants when they're first born?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I mean, it would be for them. It would be in the instance of abuse.
But every infant gets it when they're first born, unless a parent ejects. That's ludicrous.
Right. Yeah. And their bodies can't even really receive that. I mean, their immune system is coming from their mothers at that point. So that's why they have to keep getting their inoculations on an interval, is because their immune systems aren't developed enough to be able to benefit from the vaccines. But we're kind of getting off topic. The point I was trying to make with that is, like, you could have a reason why you would want to get a hepatitis vaccine, and it would, protect you from, the hepatitis virus is not good to have.
No.
And if you can prevent that, that's probably wise because it wrecks your liver and you kind of need the liver for, a lot of stuff. So the risk with the flu vaccine would be higher, I would think, because you're getting it every year, right?
Yes, it's a compounded dosage.
Yeah. What happens with the virus as it reproduces is that there's no RNA proofreading. Okay. So as it replicates, it doesn't check to make sure that it's encoding the right genetic material. And so there's errors, probably like 1 out of every 10,000 nucleotides is incorrect as it replicates. And so you think about how many billions of viruses there are and how many times it's replicating. There's some genetic drift going on. Okay. And then there's also not just the genetic drift, but even more profound is something called gene reassortment. So this is when, let's say you get infected with 2 different strains of the flu at the same time. Well, there's going to be gene reassortment where they pass genetic material back and forth and they end up with something else and you end up with a whole new strain altogether. And when there's a mutation that affects the position of the outside proteins, then your vaccine isn't going to work anymore. And so like you just have to have a small change to the outside of the cell where you push the protein out of position, or protein has, a different amino acid, it has arginine where it should have had leucine, or something like that. And all of a sudden your vaccine doesn't work. It's ineffective. And like we were talking about earlier at the top of the show, there's no getting close. It has to be exact. You can't just get close and solve the issue. That's not how our immune system works, or else, again, major problems would be occurring in the body.
So we'll go back to GBS for a minute. What do you think caused the increase from the swine flu vaccination back in 1976? There was a 1 case of GBS per 100,000 people who got the vaccine at that time.
There could be that our detection methods have increased or that the awareness is higher. I don't know what causation is. I just know that number is increased.
So the risk of GBS from getting a flu vaccine is probably it's probably rare, but I'd still say it's probably higher than what the CDC is mentioning. And I would still say that it's probably not worth getting a flu vaccination every year because of everything that we've talked about before, especially if you're getting a thimerosal dose every year. That's ludicrous. I mean, imagine a child with all the vaccinations they get. Granted, a lot of thimerosal has been removed from many of the vaccinations, mainly like MMR, for example. But getting one every year, it's a compounded dosage of, whatever. If you are getting thimerosal, you're getting it every single year, and you're getting a vaccine that might not even protect you from the flu to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, it is roughly 50 micrograms, so it's not a huge amount.
But if you're having issues producing endogenous glutathione, let's say you're mold burdened, it cause worse, or you got 10 amalgams in your mouth, Yeah.
I'd be more worried about that, or, the external environment, where you're getting mercury from.
Eating a lot of seafood, a lot of tuna, you just didn't know any better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but
well,
I mean, that's the thing is when we're injecting this, into it's the immune reactions that we have to as well, like you mentioned beforehand, that cause all problems. So the flu vaccine, what's the, if we can't guess it, completely, like hepatitis A, for example, get it right, or the body has lasting immunity, or at least a good chunk of immunity, then what's the point of even getting it? If it does cause, if it possibly could cause issues, or even does cause issues in some people, then what's the point?
Yeah, when my oldest son was first born, I was the typical paranoid parent, and I was working in a school, and I was teaching a lot of kids, and I'm a music teacher. And so something that I do every class period is go down the row, and somebody hands me a violin, and I put it up to my face, and I put my chin on the chin rest, and I tune this instrument that some other kid has been playing. So my risk I'm around a lot of kids, and I put my face on something they put their face on. And so my my risk, I think, was a little higher for the flu. And I considered getting the flu shot because I didn't want to get the flu and come home and get my infant son sick. Now, he turned 5 yesterday. So we're talking about, he was a November baby. So he's an infant right at the start of the cold and flu season. So I considered getting the flu shot, and I started doing my research. I just wanted to see how well it worked, what it did, and of course, you read information, it's biased depending on where it's coming from. But I just wanted to find some statistical reports, and there wasn't a lot out there. I mean, it wasn't until I don't think it was until 2018 where they actually released a study that had enough data to really show efficacy. Or the lack
thereof. Well, they've been doing studies since the same studies from the CDC since like 2000 and in the 2000s, because I have the older studies. But the thing is the one that I shared with you, which was the 2015-2016 study. And the study since then, they haven't finalized their data yet. That was the only study that showed the evidence or the cases of people who did not receive the flu shot. And if they got it, where the other studies never gave that variable at all. It just wasn't there.
Right.
So as you can see, like one thing I wanted to mention too is that the number of deaths associated with influenza deaths, they really didn't start using the flu vaccination outside of select populations of people who might be at risk for getting the flu until about the year 2000s, when they started using it, putting it everywhere. 2010 is when they really ramped it up, requiring most hospitals required their workers to get it everywhere and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, I know this is, again, just speculation, but the amount of deaths overall from the flu have greatly increased since then. I mean, the CDC posts the data from as early as the mid 1970s, and the average people that have died from underlying pneumonia or influenza causes, or the people who have died from cardiovascular causes as well, and respiratory causes if they have the flu. And I mean, it's most of your data back then in the early days was, the average year people would die anywhere between 1,000 to 10,000. Usually about 1,000, 6,000, somewhere around there, usually would die of the flu each year. And if you had cardiac cases, it would be much higher. It'd be anywhere between 10 to 30,000. But that number drastically increased the more they introduced Tamiflu. We'll talk about Tamiflu and why I don't recommend it when we talk about things you can do to protect yourself or things you can do to help with if you have the flu, as well as they increased the flu vaccination. I mean, last year they were talking about that 60,000 people have died from the flu. And now you'll say greater detection methods, which most people will say, but that's not necessarily the case. They're still classifying the flu deaths the same way as by codes, so it's just interesting. And I actually looked at a study that was talking about, PCR testing for the flu and the many different methods they tested for the flu. And this relatively been done, through different methods this whole time. So I don't think they've gotten quote unquote any better. And maybe I could be wrong about that, but yeah, more people are dying from the flu now than ever. Per year within the United States, and other than outside of the Spanish flu epidemic, but I'm just talking about it in general year to year. So it's interesting of why it's increasing, and I really don't have an answer for that outside of maybe the use of Tamiflu causing problems, or maybe the increase in flu vaccination somehow or another. That's the only correlation that I see.
It could be that our PCR testing is more accurate, and that there could be some other causes too. It'd be really difficult to just say, well, this occurred at the same time and this occurred at the same time. Therefore,
and it's not population changes either, because each decade I analyzed the population increase in the United States, and always was relatively stable, anywhere within the millions. So, I mean, it's not like the population has greatly increased, since 2000 to 2009 and 2010 till 2018 now. So it's not that. So something's going on, and I don't, and so one thing I want to mention too, real quick, is when they talk about the flu vaccination of how it cannot cause the flu. One thing I do want to mention is the FluMist vaccination. It could cause the flu, couldn't it?
The flu vaccine. What did you say?
The FluMist vaccine, the live attenuated, that could cause the flu, could it not?
It's possible, yeah. If there was. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's possible for sure.
I just want to throw it out there that yes, the vaccine that you get in your arm, that does not quote unquote directly cause the flu. But
No, it's
FluMist,
not possible
the
for that
live
to happen.
attenuated one, could.
It's more possible. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's within the realm of possibility. Whereas, the people that say, "Well, I got the flu shot, and the next day I had the flu," like, well, you didn't get it from the flu shot. It's not possible at all. So that's fake
But
news.
if you took the FluMist vaccination, on the other hand, and you got it 2 to 3 days later afterwards, then yes, it is possible.
Yeah, I mean, Tamiflu, it has a relatively short half-life. The half-life's between like 1 and 3 hours. It's out of your system pretty quickly. Instead of using an M2 ion channel blocker, they've tried to attack, or I guess not attack the virus, but they've tried to stop its replication by going after the neuraminidase enzyme. And so basically what it does is it cleaves off part of our cells so that the virus can't attach to it, and then it gets stuck in the cell and it can't replicate. It seems to be pretty effective. Like if I had the flu, I would consider taking it if I needed to get back to work faster, something like that. Nothing is without side effects or
But there are issues associated
complications.
with Tamiflu. The mild side effects associated with Tamiflu are just gastrointestinal upset. But there are more severe side effects associated with it, like mental health disorders or triggering psychotic episodes in children.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, and those are kind of rare. I mean, I've taken Tamiflu before, and I didn't lose my mind. I don't think so.
Well, they're rare in adults, but not so much rare in children, though, however. Japan, there's a package insert warning, about giving the drug to children, and overall restricted use of the drug in children because of psychiatric events. Where Japan used to be the biggest consumer of
Yeah.
it, and now there's warnings in there for that. And there's also a possible cause of QT long prolongation associated with the use of Tamiflu, and maybe the minor risk of increased risk of Stevens-Johnson syndrome or TIN. Because there are certain, medications. We don't know exactly what is the cause of Stevens-Johnson syndrome or TIN yet. We do know there are certain medications that may have an associated risk greater than others. Now, granted, Tamiflu does not have a black box warning associated with SGS and TIN. And most SGS cases are rare, even with elevations, medications that have an associated risk, like modafinil, for example, one of Dave Asprey's safer than caffeine, at least for toxicology, but nonetheless, it does have a black box warning label for SGS. SJS, Stevens-Johnson syndrome, it's still lower. But still, nonetheless, Tamiflu does have has been known to cause it more than, standard medication, as well as also causing cardiovascular events like increased QT long prolongation.
Yeah.
So we just need more studies associated with Tamiflu and RAID. One of the best studies I've ever read on it was the Tamiflu fiasco and lessons learned in the Indian Journal of Pharmacological Medicine. And they pretty much sum up Tamiflu with, the harms are underplayed and the benefits are overplayed.
Yeah, it depends on the subtype again, because it depends on what type of N variant. Like N1, for instance, Tamiflu doesn't seem to have much effect on at all, but some of the others it really does. So, but the thing is with that, you can make that choice because you know what strain you've got, and then, or I guess subtype you've got, and then you can figure out whether or not you should take it,
So why don't we spend the last few minutes, Jason, talking about things that people can do to maybe possibly prevent themselves from getting influenza, and if they do get influenza, things that they can do to maybe shorten its duration and the severity of the symptom.
Okay, so I'll tell you some things that are more effective than the flu shot. Washing your hands, more effective than the flu shot. Do not touch your eyes or mouth unless you've just washed your hands. More effective than the flu shot. Make sure your vitamin D levels are up.
Make sure that they are normal, that you got plenty of sun during the summer, or if need, possibly, take cod liver for vitamin D. But yes, that would also decrease the rate of which you chance of you getting the flu. Or what about if you have the flu, wearing a mask? Wouldn't that, and washing your hands thoroughly, wouldn't that prevent a spreading of the germs more than getting the flu vaccine itself? Just, if we're talking about herd immunity. So
yeah, for sure. If you have the flu, don't spread it around for sure, because it can kill people.
Maybe if you have to go to the
It's no
hospital,
joke.
even to visit a loved one, unless it's they're having a medical emergency.
Yeah, for sure. Don't go to the hospital if you're sick. Well, I mean, unless you're the one that's the patient at the hospital, you know what I mean?
Well,
But
you know what I mean. Like if you
yeah,
have a mild case of the flu and you're not dying from the flu,
right, right.
don't spread it. Yeah, the use of elderberry,
Yeah.
which is widely known in Great Britain for its use effectiveness against both cold, the rhinoviruses, and influenza, has been shown to reduce the severity of both and reduce symptomology of both.
It's fascinating to me too, because I grow elderberry. It's like a shrub that I use, like a decorative shrub that I use around my house. I grow a lot of stuff too, and I have to like kind of be select. I need stuff that looks like a shrub, or else my neighbors are going to think I'm crazy, and I kind of am. So, but anyway, like with the elderberries, they start to fruit like right at the time that you need them. Like right when the cold and flu season is hitting. That's when you start to get berries on your shrubs, and I think that's super cool that it happens that way. If you can grow them, it's much cheaper than buying the elderberry syrup. It's like what, $20 a pop or something like that.
It's expensive stuff.
Yeah, it's not cheap. But if you're sick with the flu, it's going to be money well spent because it works.
Yes, as well as I'm going to say a controversial supplement here, which is vitamin C. I know people go back and forth about whether vitamin C has any efficiency against viruses, but nonetheless, I've seen it help many people, including myself. I don't think it doesn't really do much really to prevent. I don't think, unlike vitamin D, endogenous vitamin D levels do, but I do think it does help shorten the duration and severity of many viruses. So I do believe in Linus's Pauling's work with vitamin C. So I do recommend its use, as well as I do recommend the use of echinacea. It does work similar to elderberry. Now, we'll say this: if you are suffering from cytokine issues or an elevated Th1 over exaggerated Th1 response due to the flu, you would not want to take elderberry or echinacea because it will make it worse. Instead, now I don't recommend conventional methods of tackling a cytokine storm, which are angiotensin 2 receptor medications and aspirin. I instead would recommend the use of curcumin.
More specifically, though, you're going to want a liposomal form of that, like what is it, Minerva
Seeking
SR?
Health. Seeking Health has a good one, or Minerva SR, the S by 4. Good. What about omega-3 fatty acid supplementation? That would work very well against a Th1 cytokine storm.
Yeah. The issue with the cytokine storm is like the chicken or the egg type of thing, where is it the cytokine storm happening because the prevalence of the virus, or is it something wrong with the immune system itself? Like, and that's something that we've always thought of as like, well, shouldn't we still be treating the virus anyway? And so if you do take elderberry or something and you have a cytokine storm, it's going to make the cytokine storm worse, but there's a lot of viral interaction. There's a lot of tissue damage. I mean, you're going to have to do something to the virus anyway. And
would it be better to try zinc acetate and getting sunlight if you're able to make vitamin D, depending on where you live in the winter, and vitamin C, and maybe very low doses of elderberry if you could tolerate that? Because cytokine storms can cause a severity within flu in the lungs that can cause death. So you kind of want to titrate your dosage depending on your reaction to the regulation of the Th1 immune system itself. You don't want to overregulate it to the point where you kill yourself.
Well, yeah.
You need to be in the hospital anyway.
I mean, if you've got to the point where you're that sick, where you have cytokine storm, you're not going to like be going to the drugstore looking for elderberry extract syrup or whatever. Like it's not going to happen. And so there's even cases where they've put people on interferon, which is basically cytokine therapy anyway. So it's like, okay, I have cytokine storm, and now you're giving me interferon. Does that make any sense to you?
No.
Well, it does if you're trying to kill the virus, and you're in a place where they can, where if you're having like pulmonary edema and stuff, they can kind of treat you for that by draining the lungs and so on.
But again, what we mentioned earlier, though with H1N1, for example, it's not necessarily the virus itself. that's extremely pathogenic. It's the ability for it to trigger an extreme immune response.
Well, it does damage the lung tissues and the nasal tissues. Like
It does, but
how it's different than the
not compared to other subtypes though. It seems with H1N1 specifically, the cytokine response by the body is worse in most cases than the virus itself.
Yeah, like it's just the same case with Ebola and SARS and I don't know, like a million other viruses that, it's like, okay, well, it's the cytokine storm that's killing people. It's like, okay, yeah, but the virus is also killing people. It's also killing their tissues. So which one is it's the chicken or the egg here? So anyway, we probably should wrap up on this anyway. So I hope we gave you guys some good information on the flu vaccine, whether or not you should take it. If you're dealing with older people or infants or something, maybe wear a mask instead.
Wash your hands.
Gloves. Yeah, wash your hands a lot. It's definitely going to be more effective.
Don't use triclosan or anything like that. Try to use some sort of natural essential oil type soap or something.
Yeah, and so yeah, just be smart. If you get the flu shot, it's probably not going to kill you, but you probably won't have any side effects, but you might. So it's not 100% risk free. I don't think that it's very effective. So I don't think even if they do hit the nail on the head, I think that the virus is gonna. It's basically going to have some kind of a genetic drift before you're going to be protected from it, or there's going to be another subtype that you're going to come in contact with. So anyway, I just be smart, stay healthy, make sure your nutrition's good, make sure that you're exercising, all that good stuff.
Sleeping well.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to say.
Getting sun. If you take care of yourself, you should, it's going to go a long way to protecting you against the flu more than a flu vaccination in the current form ever would.
Yeah, for sure. All right, everybody, stay healthy. And look forward to doing another podcast soon.
Take care. Bye, everybody.
All right.